May 6, 1980, Queens, New York, 2:47 a.m. Two U.S. Marshals are standing at the front door of a house in a neighborhood that used to feel safe. They're not there to make an arrest. They're there to make a family disappear. Inside that house, 13-year-old Gregg and 11-year-old Gina are being handed trash bags. The heavy-duty kind, the ones meant for leaves and garden clippings, and told they have roughly an hour to pack everything they want to keep from their childhood. Whatever doesn't fit gets left behind, forever. That night, the Hill family vanished from New York without saying a word to a single person who loved them. No goodbye to grandparents, no explanation to friends. Their old names, their old street, their old lives, all of it gone before sunrise. The federal government had just handed Henry Hill the most expensive second chance in American history. He was about to spend the next 7 years destroying it in the most spectacular way possible. Here's something the movie doesn't tell you. Henry Hill did not flip because he had a conscience. He flipped because Jimmy Burke, the man Ray Liotta calls his best friend in Goodfellas, had quietly started killing everyone who touched the Lufthansa heist money. Drivers, lookouts, anyone who knew too much or talked too loud. Henry did the math and realized he was getting close to the top of that list. So he walked into an FBI field office and made a deal. And while he was sitting across the table from federal agents negotiating to save his own life, Henry asked, with a completely straight face, whether he could bring 2 of his girlfriends into witness protection alongside his wife Karen and their kids. The marshals said no. Henry looked mildly disappointed and signed the paperwork anyway. That request tells you everything you need to know about what came next. The U.S. Marshals' plan was clean and sensible. Drop the family somewhere anonymous, somewhere nobody with a grudge and a plane ticket would think to look. They chose Omaha, Nebraska. Middle of the country, quiet, forgettable, perfect. Henry lasted approximately 1 evening. On their very first night in federal protection, a family that was supposed to be invisible, living under fake names, hiding from people who had allegedly placed a $2 million bounty on Henry's head. He took everyone out to dinner. The restaurant he picked was a regional chain called Godfather's Pizza. Neon sign over the door. The word Godfather in big red letters. The man hiding from the actual boss of the Lucchese crime family chose to eat beneath a glowing tribute to the concept on night 1. And it didn't stop there. Instead of keeping his head down, Henry started walking to public payphones around Omaha and making collect calls back to his old contacts in New York. Mob guys, people connected to the exact organization that wanted him buried. Every single one of those calls was a flare going up over his location. And back in New York, someone was already paying attention. Jimmy Burke had been overheard inside a federal courthouse murmuring that he knew Henry was somewhere in the Midwest. The bounty was real. The threat was real. And Henry was essentially mailing out his home address once a week. The marshals scrambled. The family was pulled out of Omaha in the middle of the night and driven south to Independence, Kentucky. New town, new names, same Henry. Kentucky introduced Henry to Turfway Park Racetrack, and Turfway Park introduced Henry to a fresh set of victims. Within weeks, he was running betting scams, working every angle the track offered, and somehow, the details have never been fully explained, managing to get tangled up in some kind of shady arrangement involving the state's governor. He also had a registered racehorse named Banana Split shipped across the country for his daughter. Let that settle in for a moment. A protected federal witness, living under a government alias with a $2 million contract allegedly on his head, importing a horse across state lines while Jimmy Burke's people were still actively canvassing for him. The U.S. Marshals were spending taxpayer money to keep this man alive while he was leaving a paper trail you could follow on a bicycle. But the horse was nothing. In 1981, under his government-issued name Martin Lewis, Henry met a woman named Sherry Anders. He didn't mention his real name. He didn't mention Karen or Gregg or Gina or the Federal Protection Program or the Lucchese crime family or the $2 million. or any of the other relevant details about his life. He married her in a wedding chapel in Virginia City, Nevada. Federal bigamy funded by the American taxpayer. By this point, the U.S. Marshals had relocated the family 4 separate times. They would do it again. But the racetrack and the secret wedding, as absurd as they are, aren't the real story here. The real story is what was happening behind the front door of whatever house the Marshals had dropped them in that particular month. In 2004, Gregg and Gina Hill published a memoir called On the Run, A Mafia Childhood. What they described wasn't a family that had been saved by witness protection. It was a family that had been sealed inside a container with the most dangerous person in their world, with no escape route and no outside help. Back in New York, even with everything that was wrong, the kids had grandparents nearby. They had neighbors. They had familiar streets where they could breathe. In Witsec, they had nothing, just unfamiliar towns, strangers who couldn't know the truth about them, and a father whose behavior was deteriorating by the month. Henry was a physically violent, severe alcoholic with a cocaine habit he made zero effort to conceal. Gregg described seeing garbage bags full of marijuana sitting openly in the family living room. Henry would disappear for days at a time, come back in a rage, and the children learned to read him the way you learn to read bad weather. Not to predict it, just to get out of the way in time. When he went quiet, something was building. When he got loud, it had already arrived. Gregg, as a teenager, was physically stepping between his parents during fights. A boy trying to protect his mother from a man who had spent his entire adult life around people who solved problems with violence. And every few months the phone would ring. Another relocation, another school, another set of fake names. Another round of lies to tell classmates they'd never see again. Whatever friendships had started forming would disappear overnight. The cycle reset. And it kept resetting. Karen, according to her own children, wasn't a passive observer either. She helped Henry hide drugs from the Marshals, coached the kids on what to say during official check-ins, and worked to maintain the appearance that the family was following the program's rules, while Henry ran scams and Karen covered his tracks. The Marshals eventually moved them to Redmond, Washington, a small town outside Seattle. Henry's plan for blending into the Pacific Northwest was to buy brand new flannel shirts from a department store, walk into a local Goodwill and trade them for worn-in ones so he'd look like he belonged. He later claimed he'd learned the trick from undercover NYPD officers. That was his version of going incognito. The flannel shirts could not disguise what he was actually doing. In 1987, Henry set up a cocaine distribution pipeline in the Seattle area and got caught trying to sell a pound of cocaine to DEA agents working undercover. Not a personal use quantity. Distribution weight run by a man the federal government was actively paying to protect. That was the line they couldn't cross past. The government had absorbed the blown covers, the payphone calls, the racetrack scams, the bigamy, the horse, the violence, the relocations. 7 years of it. A pound of cocaine destined for the streets was the end. Henry Hill was officially removed from the witness protection program. Karen filed for divorce in 1990, and she and the children kept their government aliases and disappeared permanently without him. Gregg had already left on his own years earlier, changed his name, cut every tie, vanished because staying was going to kill him faster than the mob ever could. Henry was alone. No shield, no program, no family. Completely exposed for the first time since he'd walked into that FBI office. And here is the part that changes the whole shape of this story. Nobody killed him. By the late 90s, Henry Hill was living under his real name, in the open, doing drunken call-ins to the Howard Stern show and slurring stories about Jimmy Burke like it was a party trick. He showed up on cable news specials about organized crime, grinning at cameras, casually discussing people who would have had him killed a decade earlier without blinking. He opened a restaurant in West Haven, Connecticut called Wise Guys. It lasted a month before a fire shut it down. He sold his own brand of marinara sauce online under the name Sunday everyday gravy. He listed amateur mob-themed watercolor paintings on eBay. The man who inspired one of the most celebrated crime films ever made was hawking pasta jars and paintings for beer money, completely out in the open, and not a single person from his old life lifted a finger. Why? Because the people who wanted Henry Hill dead were already dead themselves. Paul Vario, the Lucchese capo who had run Henry for 2 decades, died in a federal prison in Fort Worth, Texas in May 1988. Jimmy Burke died behind bars in April 1996. Tommy DeSimone had been gone since January 1979, killed before Henry even entered the program. The Lucchese and Gambino families spent the entire 1980s and 90s getting gutted by federal RICO prosecutions. Bosses went to prison. Entire crews collapsed. By the time Henry was making radio appearances using his real name, the organizations that once would have spent any amount of money to silence a rat were barely functional. And then there was the simple question of what Henry Hill had actually become. A broke, severely addicted man selling pasta sauce on the internet. Killing him would have brought the full weight of FBI attention crashing down on whatever was left of New York organized crime. For what? He had no information left to give. He had no power, no connections. He was already collapsing under his own weight faster than any contract killer could manage. So the mob did something colder than putting a bullet in him. They simply didn't bother. They let him fade, let him sit in the wreckage of every choice he'd ever made, selling marinara sauce and doing drunk radio until his body finally ran out of road. Henry Hill died on June 12, 2012. One day after his 69th birthday, in a Los Angeles hospital. Heart failure after a lifetime of cocaine, alcohol, and everything that came with it. His girlfriend, Lisa Caserta, told reporters he went peacefully. Gregg and Gina, somewhere in the United States, were still living under the names the federal government gave them decades ago. Karen had built a new life under her assumed name and never looked back. The family Henry dragged through 7 years of witness protection never fully came out the other side. Goodfellas ends with a punchline about suburban mediocrity. The real ending was 40 years of damage the mafia didn't even have to cause. They just had to wait.